I'd like to welcome you to this webinar today. My name is Bill Baker with Firestorm, and we're pleased to have you joining us for this Georgia Independent School Association sponsored webinar. This is part of the Crisis Coach webinar series. Today we're discussing communication breakdown. It's always the same. This is the 11th in the series. You can go to firestorm.com and you can watch previous webinars on our YouTube channel. You can also register for future webinars in the Crisis Coach webinar series. We'd also like you to be our friend. Facebook, you can become our friend at Firestorm Solutions. You can also follow us on Twitter, Firestorm Soul. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that our presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and this information should be discussed in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret this information as legal advice or legal opinion. Firestorm is delighted to have an ongoing relationship with our good friends at the Georgia Independent School Association. They provide marvelous services to their members, and we hope that those of you who are in attendance that are not members would consider membership in the organization.
And I don't think Jeff's with us, Bill.
No, Jeff apparently he is very frequently visiting the schools in his organization, so we excuse Jeff today.
And Jeff is out, and I think that's an important thing for everyone on the call to know and to hear. If you find yourself in a crisis, I recommend that you touch base with Jeff and Firestorm in our relationship with the Georgia Independent Association. Will certainly provide you help and assistance initially in evaluating what's going on and what you need to do. In fact, Jeff had referred a school to us last week that was facing a crisis here in Georgia. But my name is Jim Satterfield. I'm glad to be speaking with you again today and as part of our series. And as Bill pointed out, all of these have been recorded, so if you want to go back or share them with those within your school, you certainly can do it. We've been discussing things around what lessons we can learn when these bad things or crises happen. And we find that the communications breakdowns occur often when there really isn't a plan, when the messages aren't well crafted and thought out in advance. It's easier to edit than it is to create. So what we're going to do today is to focus on what we see happening and provide some insights so that you can think about your school, your students, your parents, your teachers, to be able to be prepared to figure out what we're going to do in each one of these areas. And so we're going to focus on this communications breakdown in a crisis. One comment in general is whatever tensions are present in your school before an event, they'll be magnified during that event. I think our news is being dominated this week by a lot of the events that are going on at the University of Missouri, and we've seen the communications breakdowns there and how that has become escalated in a variety of ways. And so what we want to do is to kind of go behind the scenes and look at that. And so we want to figure out where do you start. And I would think that one of the first things that you want to think about is what could be your school's next crisis. As we think about it, many times active shooter comes to top of mind, or there's some behaviors of concern, or other episodes that would come into play within your school. And we can tell you many times what your next crisis will be. It will be how you respond to the one that's right in front of you. So if we're going to focus today specifically on crisis communications and what we need to do, let's take a look at where you start. First, why is it so critical? Well, if we say the wrong thing, it's going to have an extremely negative impact on our school and on our students and on our teachers and staff. And so the old phrase from World War II, loose lips sink ships, in a crisis, loose lips sink more than those ships. They can certainly impact the brand and reputation of your school, or what's going to happen to the individuals there for years to come. The crisis is generally very short, and we look at those time frames, but the consequences from that will last for an exceedingly long period. So if you find yourself in a crisis, the first piece of advice that we can give you, stop. Before you speak, before you send out that email blast, before you write a letter to the teachers and students, before you post something on your website, and before you have a conversation with the media, we want you to stop and ask why. We find that many times there's a rush to say, look, we want to get in front of this, we want to get our message out, we want to carry that forward. And most everything you learn initially in this crisis is going to be wrong. So you're going to be forced to make decisions and make comments based upon wrong or incomplete information. And once you lose credibility, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to regain it. So here's a rule, and it's the rule of 5. And that means you're going to stop when you're faced with this, and everybody says, we got to get our message out. Jim, you don't understand our school. That's not who we are. We want to be transparent. It's stop. Ask why. Ask why you're about to do this communications. I spoke to a group this morning, a breakfast meeting of CEOs, and there was a former state of Georgia public elected official there, and we were talking through about crisis and crisis communications, and I brought up the why, and that official told a story about an event that they were involved in where everybody wanted to go and talk to the media, and it would have been an absolute disaster. And in fact, when they sent a particular person, it turned out that way. The stopping and asking why is very important. Think about the situation that we've all been in with a small child. You tell them something, and their first response back is why, and then you answer it that and explain why, and then they go why, and you're forced to do it again, and it moves through the process until either they relent or your patience is worn out. And one of the ladies in our organization said that she turns and says, well, God told us to do it that way. Unfortunately for her, in that particular situation, I don't think it finished that single dialogue. But if you stop and ask why you're communicating, and what is it that you're going to get out of it, what is it the goal that you're associated with it, that's the simplest first step. So anytime someone says, we need to communicate, tell them to stop and ask them why. And as you repeat that word why 5 times for each one of the answers they give, if you've gone all through that and it still makes sense, you should go ahead and do the communication. If it doesn't, you shouldn't. There will be a time to communicate, and initially that's not it at this particular point in time when the crisis first starts associated with it. So what do we do then? If we're not going to communicate, where do we go? Well, you've seen us talk in these series about predict, plan, perform. When you find yourself in a crisis, stop and then predict. What is our vulnerability? What's the threat here? What's the impact going to be? What do we need to monitor and see if this is going to occur? What are the triggers in which we then need to have a plan or strategy or have a communication that goes out? Then plan what that is. What are the actions we're going to take? You should have a crisis management plan within your school in addition to your emergency plan. And when you think about most events in a school, there are only 4 things you can do. You can shelter in place, you can lock out, lock down, or you can evacuate. Those are the standard protocols that schools are measured by in their response in a crisis. So look at the plan and look at the strategy. If you've identified the vulnerabilities and threats over here in the predict area, now what you want to do is to identify who your stakeholders are. And in a school, that's fairly straightforward. It's our students, it's our teachers, it's our staff, it's our parents. Those are the people that we need to communicate with. So for every vulnerability and threat, let's write out the message maps of what we would say in each of those areas. And then finally, we would perform. You would speak, you deliver the message or send the statement. And we'll share some other insights around this as we continue to go forward. So the first thing is to ask why. Then second is to look at this predict, plan, perform, to start to map out what you see happening next, and that will help drive your communications. Now, When we think about crisis communications and we go back to this predict, plan, perform, the first predict is who's the audience? Who is it you're speaking to? You might speak one way to the students in your lower school, a different in your middle and your upper school. There's a different level of sophistication there. Parents are going to have other concerns associated. So for each one, around the vulnerability and threat, you want to identify the audience, the stakeholder, as we would refer to them, and then finally, what are their concerns? What are they going to really be concerned about associated with it? Then the plan is you tailor the message, the messenger and the media there is really the word medium. How will I get my message out? And what is the modality that I'll use in that particular area? One of the things you want to be very careful about are written messages because they will have a life and live a long time after they're sent and can be used to create additional problems. In many cases, though, posting a message and putting it up on your website might be good because then the media can go there and see what it is that you're saying and not be interrupted, and then they'll have the full story instead of the soundbite that they're looking for. So you tailor those messages to each stakeholder group as you write them out. A general rule that we found, it's easier to edit than it is to create. So if you think about the types of things that would be of concern, craft those messages out, then you can adjust them at the time you need to. It also allows you to be able to respond quickly when that in fact is called for. And then finally under the form, you focus on what your three key messages. In a crisis event, both before, during, and after, people aren't going to listen to an hour sermon associated with the event coming. They're going to want to hear what are the critical things that they need to know. And so we break those down into three messages. And so when the question is asked, here's my first message, and then my second, and then my third. Firestorm did the crisis management at Virginia Tech, as we have for numerous K through 12 public and private schools and colleges and universities around the country. But the three key messages at Virginia Tech after the shootings 8 years ago, and that was the worst and still is the worst example of workplace violence in the United States of America, were will not be defined by this event, we'll invent the future, and then we will embrace the families. So if you find yourself trapped and there's a crisis that's emerged and you've got to communicate, instead of saying no comment or saying what you wish was true, stop. Ask that why. Think about the predict, plan, perform, and then your messages should come forward. Write down those phrases that I just gave you. Will not be defined by the event. Whatever bad thing that's happened, that's not what your school stands for. It's not your mission. It's not who your students are. It's not who your teachers are. It's not what your community is expecting. Second, we're going to invent the future. Whatever problem happened, then we're going to address it and make sure that we meet or exceed all standards and best practices. If you didn't do a background check, we're going to make sure that we do that in the future. If you didn't have the right controls in place or the training was there, but we're not going to talk about the problem. We're going to be talking about the future. And then finally, if there's a crisis, every crisis is a human crisis. So sharing that story, sharing that you're interested and concerned, and your heart goes out to those individuals, that will really help you. So this is your crash course today in crisis communications and planning. So why is crisis communication so hard? If that's all it is, Jim, just figure out what's going to happen, put your three messages there, and move on. Well, when we think about the environment that we're in a crisis, look at the descriptors there that are up on the screen in front of you. We've got some escalating flows of events. Things are starting to happen. And by the way, every time someone tells us that in a crisis that would never happen, people would never do that, yep, that's exactly what they did. They did exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong time in exactly the worst way possible. So you've got an escalating flow of events, and all the information you get initially about that will either be inaccurate, wrong, or insufficient. If you've got all the information on a subject, you can make a decision. It's easy to do that. Leadership in business and in schools and academics and education, they've got research. They can look at it and point to those types of things. But in a crisis, the information you're being told is wrong, and you're going to be forced then to make a choice between here's a bad choice and there's a bad choice. Which would you like to do? It's not that one's right and one's wrong. My grandfather had a line, which would you rather have or a whipping? Well, that's pretty clear. I think I could figure that out, which one of those I'd like. But in these crisis situations, all the choices are going to be bad. That's why it's going to be important then to make a decision and monitor and then adjust as you need to. Clearly, you'll be under intense scrutiny, and there'll be a loss of command and control. You're not going to be and be able to do everything that you need, because a crisis is not business as usual. It's business as unusual. It'll be a different environment than what you normally have. And how you respond can well create that second crisis. Say the wrong thing, say something that's not true, lose that credibility. You're going to see that you'll become directly under attack, as your brand and reputation will be. You don't want to be known as the school who did X. Every crisis is a human crisis, and it's someone's son or daughter or mother or father, and that element is within that is extremely important. Silence is associated with guilt, but there's a lot of things that we can do, and we have to choose the time we're going to talk. Now, as you focus on any of these events, they come as an absolute surprise. And that's what the difficulty will become within your school as these events happen. I tell people often the last time that a surprise was good, I was 5 years old, and it was my birthday. Well, that was a pretty good time, and it was a good surprise. But if someone comes running into your office, if you hear that announcement over the PA at school, if you see the threat that's coming into the school, and that's a surprise, that's not a good one. It's certainly going to be a bad one. So what's the process? How do we do this? How do we communicate? Where do we do and through this process? First, you've got to factually assess the situation. Determine whether a communication response is warranted at this time or ever. Now, you can't talk to one parent about another student. You're prohibited. It's inappropriate. It's illegal in many cases. If there's an injury, you can't, because of HIPAA requirements, can't talk about that. So some things you can't do. You can't talk about what happened with a specific teacher. And it's kind of a question and say, well, did you do a background on Mr. Smith? You can't say, yes, we did, or no, we didn't. Because once you open that door, you can't stop talking about it. What you would say is you can appreciate, well, I can't talk about a specific teacher. I can tell you that we do background checks on every teacher that works in our school. By the way, annual background, that's the standard and best practices. So if you only did your background check when you hired that teacher, now you probably have a gap in exposure. So what you want to do is, we will probably communicate. It just may not be at this particular incident having it occurred. As we think about communications, they're divided into three categories, and those are either coordination communications, crisis communications, or lastly, compliance communications. The initial communications will be telling people where to go and what to do. They're internal within the school. The second category is more brand and reputation, and those are external, and they'll be done later. So the initial one is, you know, school's closing today and you can pick up your child, those types of things. Now, there are some compliance communications that you're going to be required to make. For example, teachers are held to a high standard. If you think that there's a child who is exposed to violence or inappropriate contact, then those are things that you have an obligation to report. That's a compliance communication. So if you're thinking about crisis communications, look at the list here. First, identify who the key audiences are. Align your message maps. Those are the ones that you've gotten established in advance, and if you haven't done so, we can certainly help. Monitor the facts and as they continue to move forward in each of these areas. And we monitor today using social media, and we'll talk specifically about that just before we close today. Communicate to the stakeholders who require. Minimize rumors. If you don't deal with this, those rumors will start to dominate. You'll be amazed at the story that comes out about your school and your students. Minimize the rumors. Conduct debriefs at each step along the way. What did you hear? What do you know? What do we need to do next? Ask for assistance if you need it. You're not a one-man band at this point, and verify that your messages support your brand position. Some of the statements coming out of the University of Missouri don't, and you're starting to see the impact associated with it. So if we're going to talk about these things, let's talk a little bit about how do you know when to communicate. Well, you want to create an activation matrix and define here are the types of areas that we're concerned about in our school. And this is a minor event, this is an incident, and this is a business crisis. This is something that's going to affect our brand and reputation. Define that under each one of the areas, what the action would be, the message, who is responsible in those areas, and how is the crisis management team put together. If you don't have an event activation matrix, there's a tool that you can put in the hands of every teacher so that everyone would know when you see this, this is what I need you to do, and then we'll take the appropriate actions at this point, and it's linked directly back in to what you communicate. Now there's a cycle on communications and crisis communications. The one you see here is listed overall, but you should easily put the word crisis in front of that area. You gather information. Talk about what are the areas. If you're in a tornado zone, which many of us in Georgia are, what if that were to be announced, what is it that we're going to communicate? What are we going to tell our students? What are we going to tell our parents? If we're concerned about violence might occur, what is it, again, the messages that we would have in those areas? Or communicable illness. You can go through and look at your vulnerability and risk and threat assessment or your hazard impact matrix. Those will give you good starts. So you draft the messages, and we do that through a message map process and start to develop it and have them ready to go. Now something's happened. You don't just immediately go into distribution. You stop and you get approval. Is it okay now to send this message? The right message sent at the wrong time can exacerbate a problem and make it significantly worse. So make sure that your communications spokesperson or your team gets that approval from the crisis management team to know that the message can now go. Then you distribute it. Now that could be done via a text message, an email, a page announcement, a phone call. There are plenty of mass notification systems that are out there that can help you get those words out. You then have to be able to manage the inquiries that come back when people are saying, well, what does this mean? And then monitor what's going on. Today, people talk on social media, and that's going to be one of the keys for you to have an intelligence program where you're monitoring what's being said there. And so there's a program for listening and looking at particular individuals and events. And while we're focusing on what you're saying today, knowing how you're being perceived will help drive those communications at each step along the way. So how do you know what's being said or heard? It's this predictive intelligence. So having that design, having it set up, having someone sending you alerts that this is being said about the school, it really goes to giving you that analysis of the rumors and misinformation or knowing where the next attack is going to come from. Worked with a school here in Georgia just recently where there were allegations that occurred after a football game. That's not a good position to be in, and it could certainly tarnish the brand and reputation of that school and hurt the individuals who are being referenced within it. If you don't have an intelligence network designed, that's important. And so having someone that's sitting there that's trained to look at that, and they look at the streams, the phrases, the words, the issues, they establish this baseline so that when you see it suddenly the conversations pick up, you know that something's going on, and now is a time for us to start to think about what the communications, in fact, would be. So what are the components now in this crisis communication that we're dealing with? We're always going to express concern and support and offer condolences. We're not going to be looking at the blame or throwing someone under this particular event. We expect that you, if you bring in an outside crisis management firm like Firestorm or another, I would encourage you to have them retained to your general counsel, your outside law firm that works with the school. And that's to establish attorney-client privilege and contemplation of litigation. Many of these events escalate where lawsuits are filed, and it's important, since we don't know what the truth is, and finding that out may well turn to other vulnerabilities and threats. I would also encourage you to ask that crisis manager what crises they've managed before, because this is not a job for on-the-job training here. You want someone to be very clear. Look at the third bullet. tell the truth. We are never going to lie. We're never going to try to cover it up. We're never going to try to sweep it under the covers here at this point, because those things will become much worse in many cases than the actual event that occurred. So we are going to tell the truth. We are not going to rush out and release confidential information. We're not going to talk about a particular student or a particular teacher. We can only talk about our policies and procedures. But once we establish that, then we'll determine the time and the place. Now, I gave you these 3 bullets earlier in the webinar today. Not defined by the event, invent the future, embrace the families. So the first question is, if something bad happens, you've had a suicide of a student, you've had a sexual molestation by a teacher, all of these are events that we see happening in schools on a regular basis. Well, that's not really what your school is and what your school is about. Look at your mission statement. What does it say on your website? What does define your school? You'd have that out in your mind, and you'd be able to talk about that. Notice how it's much better to say, you know, we're not going to be defined by this. This is not what our school is. Our school is focused on educating the entire person, both from an academic standpoint, from an athletic standpoint, from a moral standpoint, from a citizen standpoint. That's what our school is about. Doesn't that sound better than no comment? Second, invent the future. If there's something that's happened, you're going to say, one of the first things that we're going to do is we're going to find out what occurred here. If there's an investigation and an outside authorities, we're looking to them to help us understand this process. And I can assure you that we're going to make sure that we put controls and measures in place so that this event, in fact, won't happen again. And as we think through that, that will be our message that we would give out. The last, though, is remember that every crisis is the human crisis. And so, but right now we want to think about those students and those families that were impacted. We want to focus on them and embrace them, because that's what our school community is. That's who we are and how we feel about each other here. Because this didn't happen to one, it's happened to all of us. Those 3 messages will buy you the time then to understand what's going on so that you can better communicate. Your spokesperson should, in fact, be very comfortable with it. One other big tip to tell you is don't put your head of school out as the first communicator here, recognizing that initially most of what we know is wrong. Once that person has spoken, it's hard to have any escalation. So have someone else, have them trained, and have them be prepared. Now, we always are going to focus on this why communicate. If you remember, that was the very first slide that we showed today. And the arrows up and down, that's communicating within the school and externally to the outside. Those messages we need to plan out. And if you think you need to communicate, stop. And 5 times, ask why. We need to, Jim, we've got to get our message out. The question then would be, why? Well, people need to know why, and then you lead them through in that decision process, and you're going to find most of the initial pressure on you to communicate does not need to be at the incident while the event is still occurring or in doubt or immediately thereafter, because you don't have all the facts, and your probability of misspeaking is extremely high. So you want to control that early in the process. And remember, when you're talking, it's not about you. It's not about your school. It's about the listener or the reader of the document here. That's who we're talking to. That's who we're communicating to. And if you're explaining, you're losing at this point, because they want to hear about their concerns. So we start with the home bases. Those 3 elements, think about those in advance and write them out. That's going to be our initial statements that we carry forward. It's also a safe place for us to return to if you're asked a question and you haven't got all of the answers in the particular area. Well, tell me everything. Why did this occur? I need to understand it completely. Then stay on those home bases. They empower you to answer a question that prevents you from turning your answer into the next crisis. You know, if you stand up there and say, I can assure you that didn't happen, and later it turns out that it did, now you've got a problem. That's why we're focused so heavily on having these set up. And it's easy to do. Spending a few minutes on looking on your website, on looking at what your charter is, what your mission statement is. What is it that you tell those parents that want to send their children to your school this next year? What separates you from the other schools in the area that they could attend? So we can develop it during the crisis, but we would recommend developing that in advance. That media training at the bottom, if we respond to a crisis, and we do this multiple times a week across the country, and sometimes the person there will say, oh, you don't need to do any media training with me. I know how to handle the media. Generally, that's a signal to us. That's the one person that you need to work with. The media is not your friend here. It's not their objective to get to the truth. It's their objective to create controversy and to drive traffic for their advertisers. So the home bases at Virginia Tech you see listed here. Now, if I've told you something 3 times in one webinar, that should be interpreted, this must be pretty important. We will not be defined by the event. We will invent the future. We will embrace the family. Do those messages for your schools, and then playing off those themes in the crisis that's occurring will give you a safe harbor and a chance to have the perception of your school be the one that you want. So what does define you? Stop now. Write that down. What does define our school? Write that out, and everybody ought to be able to say that in their own words. What will you do to make sure this doesn't happen again or fix the issue? What will you do to support those impacted by the crisis? We respond to events where people are taken to a hospital. Immediately you need to dispatch staff, teachers to that hospital where the student was taken. When the family arrives there, they're going to be looking for you. They're going to want to know what happened. They're going to want to know the facts associated with it. All the students and families that are still at the school will want to know and want to be communicated, and they want to know that you're taking care of everyone, just like they hope that you'll take care of your child. So those become extremely important for us as we work through it. So you've heard me use this term message maps, and message maps are 3 answers to the same question. And so here's the first thing you're going to say, here's the second thing you're going to say, and here's the third. And the way they work is if you're asked this by a parent or a student or a reporter and they ask the question, these are questions that you've been able to identify because you've done your hazard impact matrix, you've done your vulnerability analysis and say, you know, this could occur, and we're going to plan in advance what we're going to say. So when you're asked that question, you give the first answer and then you shut up. If the reporter or the person asks a follow-up question, then you give the second and you shut up. They ask the third question on that same issue, then you give your third answer and then you're quiet. If they continue in that area, then you return to your home bases. This is the most powerful tool that you can put in place before a crisis. They're concise, they're to the point, they're generally 1 sentence, at most 2 sentences long to give those specific answers out. In planning this out, and you can edit it at the time of the crisis, but it gives you that order. And when you think of those 3 messages, what's the first, what's the second, and the third? And so it gives you a way to organize those communications and have your spokesperson come across as being in control, knowledgeable, and of help at this particular time. So the way we work is identify what you most want the target audience to know. Identify what you need to do to correct any misperceptions or any erroneous information. I don't know why erroneous was hard for me today, but it was. Prepare the 3 core messages that communicate your overarching core talking points on that particular question and subject. Prepare supporting messages if you have to. If there's a follow-up question that you anticipate, what's my supporting message? Keep the messages very, very short, because I won't remember a whole page of information, but I will remember the highlight areas. And you want it to come across as conversational, not reading a speech or a pre-written document at this point in time. Now, document and writing those messages and the delivery channels. This is what we will say. This is what we will put up on our website. and go through this. And then practice delivery. If you do a tabletop exercise in your school, and I strongly recommend you take your crisis team or your incident team or your emergency team and describe a scenario to see if this occurs, and then take a look at what your actions are. As a portion of that, what should your communications be before, during, and after those events to each one of your stakeholder groups, and practice doing that. Have a mock interview set up. Have a sample meeting that you might speak at a PTA session where you are giving that message and having it delivered. You don't want the first time that you do that, or your spokesperson who does it, in a live event, because there will be difficulties, and confidence is gained from going through and practicing it. Now, there's a template for message maps, and I'm showing it on the screen right now. So you would look at that and list the question or concern. What's the impact that that question could have? What is the stakeholder that would be concerned about it? And saying it to a student might be different than saying it to a parent. They'd be similar, but the language we would use would be different. And then the first message, the second, and the third. And then finally the medium. Is this oral? Is it a phone call? Is it an email? Is it a text message? Is it a face-to-face interview? How are we doing it? Is this a message that's written and posted on our website? Is this a letter we're sending out? And each one of those areas would be defined. So you might have 50 questions that you've identified. If you wanted to put them into categories, that's another way to say, if we've had the death of a student, here are the questions that we would deal with. If we've had an allegation of sexual molestation, here are the questions that we might deal with. If we've had an allegation that there's been some misappropriations or fraud within the school, this is what we would deal with and share within that. So if you put them together and organize them, now you have a resource tool so that you can be assured that those crisis communications will be effective when you need them most. Now, when we titled today and we talked about this, we talked about the fact that it's always the same. We see the same failures where someone stands up and talks off the cuff. Someone just makes it up as they're going into it. And generally those situations don't turn out well. Now, what I want you to remember is that in the first 24 hours in every crisis that you're going to be involved with within your school, you're going to have wrong information. And you are then going to be forced to communicate and make decisions based upon those wrong information at every point. So be prepared for that. That's why having the messages put out in advance so that you've got the message maps that you can refer to makes it much easier in those areas. Now, while the first 24 hours everything is wrong, the following years then there are going to be consequences, and the consequences will be magnified by what you communicate and what you say at every step through this process. So remember those two factors, because it's not just getting something out to get something out. It's just not making a statement so you can say, we made a statement. You stop, you predict what could happen. What would the consequences be as a result of that? And then evaluate the value of having that communication at this point. Who's the right person to be delivering it? What are we hoping to gain from it? And one thing to always remember, if someone doesn't like you, if someone hates you, if someone resents the fact that there's an independent school that's providing this education and other kids aren't getting that, they're not going to listen nor accept what you say. There's no amount of words that will change someone that hates you into someone that loves you and believes you within the process. So we gave you a slide early on that looked like this, and it had the loose lips comment at the top of it. But look at that purple box. The objective is to understand and establish the why of all communication. If you're placed in a role that you're going to be responsible for the communications within this event that's happened in your school, then let's establish why are we communicating at this time. Who are we communicating to? And the value of those communications must be weighed against the potential exposure or liability created by these communications. You cannot talk about a specific student. If it happened to a student in your school, you can't mention the name of that student. It's illegal. You cannot mention what you did with a specific teacher. You're under requirements there. You can't give out medical information. And most importantly, you can't say what you think happened. You can only state facts. You can only give those types of information. If you're giving speculation, if you're giving an opinion, it's not going to help the situation that you find yourself in. So stop every one of those times and remember that rule of 5. When someone comes to you and say, you know, we need to communicate on this, I want your next question to be, why? When they give you the answer, I want the next question to be, why? And until you've gone through that exercise 5 times, then you can move forward in focusing on what it is we're going to say, because you'll have a pretty good understanding of why you're talking, who you're talking to, and what you hope to get out of it, and more importantly, how you're going to measure the success or failure of that communication. You can't take those words back. Once they're out there, and those impacts will define your school for years to come. It's a very important factor to consider at each step along the way. So, what are next steps? We've talked about the failures in the past, and so we come back to say, do you want to know what will happen tomorrow? If you don't have an intelligence network, if you don't have anonymous reporting in your school, if you don't have monitoring tools that listen and monitoring tools that look at individuals, you're going to find out that you're going to be placed in a situation where it comes as a surprise, and we've already shared the value of that. You cannot afford not to know what's going on within your school, and unfortunately, many of us don't know that. We've responded recently to schools that have had allegations of sexual molestation, and those patterns were being discussed and talked about among students and parents, and that information was out. And you need to know about that and be able to be prepared to deal with it, because it is certainly not going to be helpful. If you want to have other aspects of this, you can contact us to learn about how to communicate and best practices, participate in a virtual exercise with your team. We're going to do in the first quarter next year an active shooter exercise. It gives you a chance to experience what it's like to make those decisions and communications. We'll let you know and post that announcement of the date in the first quarter. In December, on December the 8th and December 14th at 2 o'clock Eastern, we're going to do a presentation which will be a virtual cyber breach exercise. Now, it's geared to both schools and businesses. We'll have a mixed audience. We already have 1,000 companies that are going to participate in it. But if you look at the confidential information that you have in your school about families and finances and numbers and behavioral issues or medical information, a breach in a private school and an independent school could be very devastating. So if you would like to participate in that, you can go to our website and sign up for that. There is no cost. I would encourage you to create your own intelligence network and then to schedule training. There will be some opportunities for the GISA. We're looking at some dates for a spring crisis coach workshop. It'll be a day-long event, and we'll go through some management skills and a tabletop exercise. Our thanks go out to the Georgia Independent School Association and their support of all our schools across Georgia and what they do every day, and I'd like to thank each one of you for what you do in the lives of our young people. If you've got questions, feel free to reach back out to us at firestorm.com. You can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com or call us at 800-321-2219. I hope you have a great fall and a holiday season, and there's a lot to give thanks for with Thanksgiving just around the corner. We'll continue the series in December and kind of look at the year in retrospection, and then there'll be another Crisis Coach webinar series for 2016. Thank you all, and thank you for all that you do. Have a great day. Goodbye.